The bell above the bookstore door rang softly, the kind of sound most people never notice. But that afternoon, it landed in my chest, like a warning. I was standing near the children's section, one hand resting on my son's shoulder, the other gripping a canvas tote that held more hope than money. Evan was flipping through a worn copy of a space book, his lips moving as he read the captions under each planet. He always did that. Read quietly, carefully, like the world might break if he spoke too loud. The bookstore sat just off Central Park, the kind of place that smelled like paper dust and coffee from somewhere in the back. Warm light spilled through tall windows, catching in Evan's hair. For a moment, everything felt normal, safe, earned. I glanced at the price tag on a hardcover novel and felt that familiar squeeze in my chest. Too much. Again. I slid my debit card back into my wallet, pretending I'd changed my mind. Evan didn't notice. He never asked for things he knew I couldn't afford. That was when I heard the voice. Confident. Easy. Polished. A voice I had spent years unlearning. Wow, I didn't expect this place to be so charming. I didn't turn around. Not at first. My body recognized the sound before my mind would allow it to have a name. My shoulders tightened. My breath shortened. The room felt smaller. Then I heard a second voice. Lighter. Brighter. Almost rehearsed. It's adorable. Very, authentic. I closed my eyes for half a second, just enough to prepare. When I turned, there he was. Richard Hale stood near the front table, dressed like success had never questioned him. Tailored jacket, relaxed smile. The same smile he used in boardrooms, courtrooms, and every place truth was optional. His hand rested casually on the lower back of the woman beside him. Vanessa, his new wife. She was beautiful in a way that demanded to be noticed. Perfect hair, perfect posture, the kind of woman who looked like she'd never been told no in a room full of people. Richard's eyes met mine, and I watched recognition bloom across his face. Surprise first, then calculation, then something close to satisfaction. "Claire," he said loud enough for nearby shelves to hear. "Hey, wow, it's been a while." My son looked up, slowly. His fingers froze on the edge of the page. His eyes moved from me to the man standing 10 feet away. I felt Evan's hand tighten around mine, not in fear but in focus. Richard followed his gaze. Then he smiled wider. "And this must be Evan," he said, stepping closer. "You've gotten so big, buddy." Vanessa leaned down slightly, inspecting my child like an accessory. "He looks just like you," she said, though her eyes never left Richard. The air shifted. I knew this moment mattered. I knew one wrong word could cost me everything I'd fought to hold together. My job prospects, my reputation, even my son. Richard bent his knees, lowering himself to Evan's level, still smiling for the invisible audience he always imagined. "Hey," he said gently, "do you remember me?" The bookstore went quiet. Evan didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I realized something terrible and powerful at the same time. This wasn't my moment. It was his. Before the silence in that bookstore, before Richard's voice cut through the air like it still belonged there had been a time when I believed in him, completely. Richard Hale was never cruel in obvious ways. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't leave bruises anyone could point to. What he did was quieter, more precise. He edited reality until only his version remained. When we were married, I worked as a copy editor for a mid-sized publishing firm. Long hours, modest pay, honest work. I read manuscripts late at night on my MacBook, read pen notes spread across the kitchen table, while Evan slept in his crib just a room away. Richard used to tell people he was proud of me. He liked saying it out loud. It made him sound generous. What he never said was that my job made him uncomfortable. "You're too visible," he once told me, smiling like it was advice. "People talk. Publishing is political." I didn't understand what he meant until the emails surfaced, internal messages, screenshots, selective quotes, conversations stitched together to look careless, unprofessional, disloyal. They landed in my manager's inbox one Tuesday morning, anonymous but devastating. By Friday, I was called into a glass-walled office and told my position was being eliminated due to trust concerns. I kept saying there had to be a mistake. There wasn't. By the time I realized the emails had originated from a device registered to Richard's old work account, it was already too late. The firm wouldn't reopen the case. No one wanted scandal. No one wanted to be wrong. Richard held me while I cried that night, told me everything would be fine, told me I could stay home with Evan for a while, told me it was a blessing in disguise. What he didn't tell me was that 2 weeks later he'd file for divorce. The separation was clean on paper, civil, almost friendly. But when custody discussions began, the narrative had already been written. I was suddenly unstable, unemployed, a risk. His lawyer said the words gently, like they hurt him too. We're just concerned about the child's environment. I walked out of that office shaking, realizing I wasn't fighting a man anymore. I was fighting a story. And Richard was very good at telling stories that made people believe he was the hero. By the time the divorce finalized, I had lost my marriage, my job, and nearly my son. What I kept was something far less visible: the truth, and the knowledge that one day it would matter. After the divorce papers were signed, Richard didn't leave in a dramatic way. There was no final argument, no slammed doors, no last confession. He packed his things neatly, like a man closing a chapter he'd already finished reading. He took the framed awards from his office. The expensive watch, he said, was an investment. Even the leather chair he claimed helped his back. What he didn't take were the small things. Evan's crayon drawings taped to the fridge, the stack of bedtime books by the couch, the routines that actually held our life together. For weeks after he moved out, Evan waited for him. Every night at exactly 7:45, my son would pause whatever he was doing and look toward the door. He never cried. He never asked why his father hadn't called. He just waited, like waiting itself was a promise. Richard sent texts instead of showing up. Running late, big meeting, rain check, buddy. Sometimes a gift arrived in a brown box, a toy still wrapped in plastic, a note with his name typed. Not written. Evan always thanked me like I'd bought it. I learned quickly that abandonment doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like convenience. Money became tight. I sold the car and switched to public transit. I counted groceries in my head while Evan compared cereal boxes like they were puzzles. I told myself children didn't need much to be happy, but the truth was harder. They needed consistency, and I was the only one providing it. Richard, meanwhile, upgraded his life in quiet ways. A better apartment, better restaurants, better photos. I saw them online before I stopped looking. Him smiling in rooms I'd never been invited into. Vanessa appearing slowly, first as a shadow, then as a presence. When Evan asked about her, I said she was someone his father cared about. I didn't say more. The custody arrangement was fragile. One misstep, one emotional outburst, one accusation framed the right way. I lived carefully, like someone balancing glass. At night, after Evan slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and rewrote my life one freelance job at a time. Editing resumes, proofreading blogs, fixing other people's words because no one wanted to hear mine. Some nights I wondered if Richard felt any of this, the weight, the quiet, the cost. Then I remembered something my lawyer had said during mediation. He doesn't experience loss the way you do. He experiences transition. And that was the truth I carried with me into the bookstore that afternoon. Richard hadn't walked into my life again by accident. He had stepped back into a story he believed he still controlled. He didn't know yet that the ending had already changed. The week before we walked into that bookstore, my life nearly came apart. It started with an email from Richard's attorney, Sent at 6:42 on a Monday morning. The subject line was polite, neutral, almost kind, but the message underneath carried a threat wrapped in legal language. Richard was requesting a custody review. Again. I read it twice, then a third time, my coffee going cold beside me. The words blurred together, but the meaning was sharp and unmistakable. He was claiming concern. About my finances, about my stability, about Evan's environment. The same script, revised slightly, delivered with confidence. By Wednesday, I was back in my lawyer's office, sitting across from a man who had learned to speak gently when delivering bad news. He told me Richard's team had new documentation, screenshots, testimonies, statements from people who barely knew us. Nothing conclusive, he said, but enough to raise questions. Questions were dangerous. Questions opened doors I couldn't afford to walk through. I walked home in the rain that afternoon, my coat thin, my phone heavy in my pocket. Evan had a school project due the next day, a presentation about family. I stopped at the grocery store and counted bills in my head while he chose apples like it mattered which ones were happiest. That night, after he went to bed, I sat on the floor of my bedroom and cried quietly, pressing my face into a towel so he wouldn't hear. I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was crying because I was tired of being strong alone. The next morning, I packed Evan's lunch and smiled like nothing was wrong. He told me about a book he wanted to read, something about explorers and lost cities. I nodded, pretending my mind wasn't racing ahead to court dates and worst-case outcomes. On Friday, my lawyer called again. "There's a chance," he said carefully, "that the judge may order temporary adjustments." Temporary. Another word that sounded harmless and meant everything. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, counting breaths, reminding myself of what I could control. I couldn't control Richard's version of events. I couldn't control how convincing he sounded. But I could control my presence. On Saturday morning, I suggested we go to the bookstore near the park. No agenda, no distractions, just us. Evan smiled, instantly, like the idea itself had lifted something from him. I didn't know then that peace is often the calm before confrontation. I only knew that if the world was about to test me again, I wanted to walk into it holding my son's hand, grounded in something real. Because whatever Richard planned next, I refused to meet it afraid. I knew the moment they entered that the afternoon had shifted into something else. The bookstore door opened wider than it needed to, letting in a rush of cold air and city noise. Conversation softened. Pages stopped turning. People looked up, then back down again, instinctively sensing a disturbance they didn't want to claim. Richard walked in first. He moved like he belonged everywhere. Shoulders relaxed, chin lifted, eyes already scanning the room for recognition. The confidence wasn't new. It was practiced, refined over years of being believed. Vanessa followed half a step behind him, close enough to signal unity, far enough to let him lead. She wore a fitted coat and heels that clicked lightly against the wooden floor, each sound deliberate. Her hand slipped into the crook of his arm as if to mark territory. They didn't see me right away. That hurt more than I expected. They paused near the display table, pretending to admire a stack of bestsellers. Richard laughed at something Vanessa whispered, the sound easy and loud like he wanted witnesses. He picked up a book, flipped through it without reading a word, then set it back perfectly aligned. I felt Evan shift beside me. He hadn't turned yet, but his body knew something was wrong. Children sense disruption, the way animals sense weather. His fingers tightened around the edge of his book. His shoulders squared. Then Richard looked up. Our eyes met. For a split second, the smile on his face froze, like a glitch in a familiar performance. Surprise flashed across his features, quickly replaced by calculation. I watched him adjust in real time, deciding which version of himself to present. "Claire," he said, stepping forward as if we were old friends who'd simply lost touch. "Hey, this is unexpected." Vanessa followed his gaze, her eyes landing on me, then dropping briefly to my shoes, my coat, my tote bag. The assessment was quick, thorough, dismissive. Well, she said brightly, small world. Richard took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound considerate. How have you been? The question hovered there, absurd and heavy. How had I been? Surviving, counting dollars, fighting to keep my son. Rebuilding from damage he pretended hadn't come from him. Before I could answer, his eyes moved past me, to Evan. His expression softened into something almost convincing. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to my son's height, smiling the way people do when they expect forgiveness, simply for showing up. And you must be Evan, he said warmly. Wow, you've grown so much. Evan turned then, slowly. He looked at Richard the way someone looks at a stranger whose name they recognize but whose presence feels wrong. No excitement, no fear, just awareness. The space between us tightened. I realized in that moment that Richard hadn't walked into the bookstore by accident. He had walked in ready to perform. What he wasn't ready for was the audience he was about to face. Vanessa was the first to fully step into the moment. She leaned forward slightly, her smile widening as if this encounter had been scripted just for her. The kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes but demanded attention anyway. Her gaze moved from Evan to me and back again, lingering just long enough to make sure I noticed. Well, she said, tilting her head, this is unexpected. Richard didn't mention you liked coming here. Her tone was light, conversational, but the message underneath was sharp. There were places she believed belonged to her now. This, apparently, wasn't one of mine. Richard straightened, slipping naturally into his role. The concerned father, the reasonable man. He placed a hand on Vanessa's back, not lovingly, but possessively, then looked around as if to confirm we had an audience. I try to keep work and personal life separate, he said with a soft laugh. But it's really good to see you, Claire, truly. I nodded once, careful. Every instinct in me wanted to pull Evan closer, to shield him from the tension coiling in the air, but I didn't. I stayed still, calm, present. Vanessa crouched down, mirroring Richard's earlier movement, her heels wobbling slightly before she steadied herself. She smiled directly at Evan, teeth bright. I'm Vanessa, she said. I've heard so much about you. Evan didn't respond right away. He looked at her the same way he had looked at Richard. Thoughtfully, like he was deciding whether her words matched her posture. That's nice, he said finally, polite but distant. Vanessa's smile flickered just for a moment. I hope we didn't interrupt anything important, she continued, standing again and brushing imaginary dust from her coat. We were just passing by. Richard loves books, she laughed, light and practiced. I almost laughed too. Richard hadn't read a book cover to cover in years unless it benefited his image. That's right, Richard added quickly. I was actually thinking of picking something up for Evan, maybe something educational. He reached toward the shelf without waiting for an answer. I felt my heart pound, not from fear, but from the danger of what he was doing. This wasn't kindness. It was positioning, proof for later. A moment that could be reframed and reused. Evan shifted closer to me. I felt his shoulder press into my side, grounding and protective in a way that surprised me. Vanessa noticed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then softened again, like a blade sliding back into its sheath. It must be hard, she said, looking at me now, doing all this on your own. There it was. Not concern, not empathy, a quiet declaration of superiority. I met her gaze and said nothing. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's restraint. And in that moment, restraint was the only thing keeping Richard's carefully built illusion intact. He didn't know yet how fragile it was. Richard's voice changed when he realized people were listening. It wasn't louder. It wasn't sharper. It softened, rounded at the edges, carefully tuned to sound reasonable to anyone within range. The kind of voice that made strangers nod without knowing why. You know, he said, glancing around the bookstore with a small, self-aware smile. I've always loved places like this. Quiet, grounded, good for kids. He looked down at Evan again, like the thought had just occurred to him. I've been meaning to spend more time together, he added. Life's been busy, but that's no excuse. Right, buddy. I felt it immediately. The shift. This wasn't a private conversation anymore. It was a scene. Vanessa caught on just as fast. She stepped slightly to the side, positioning herself where she could be seen, her expression warm and supportive. The picture was perfect. A successful man, his elegant wife, a concerned father reconnecting in public. Evan didn't answer. Richard didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. I was actually telling Vanessa, he continued, nodding toward her, that I've been worried about you two, about how things have been since the divorce. There it was. Concern disguised as generosity. Vanessa placed a hand over her chest, playing her part effortlessly. We just want what's best for Evan, she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward a woman browsing nearby. Children need stability. My stomach tightened. Richard sighed softly, the sound of a man burdened by responsibility. I've been thinking maybe it's time we talked about options. Options. The word hung in the air like a threat dressed as opportunity. I saw the angle clearly now. This wasn't coincidence. This was groundwork. Something to reference later. Something that could be twisted into proof of effort, proof of care, proof that he had tried. I'm doing fine, I said calmly, keeping my voice even. Evan is doing fine. Richard smiled at me, a smile that used to make me doubt myself. Of course. I know you're doing your best. Vanessa nodded in agreement, her expression sympathetic in a way that felt rehearsed. It's a lot for one person, she said gently. Evan shifted again. Closer this time. His hand slipped into mine, firm and deliberate. Richard noticed. For the first time, something in his expression tightened. But maybe, he continued, pressing on, it wouldn't hurt to talk about what the future could look like, just responsibly. I understood then what he was really doing. He wasn't here to reconnect. He was here to be seen trying, to build a version of himself that could walk back into a courtroom and say, I showed up, I cared, I offered, all while putting me on display as the obstacle. The bookstore felt smaller, the air heavier. Richard believed he was in control of the narrative. He believed this was his stage. He had no idea that the most important voice in the room hadn't spoken yet, and when it did, everything he'd built would begin to crack. Evan didn't look away when Richard finished speaking. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't do any of the things adults expect children to do when they're being spoken to by someone older, someone louder, someone trying too hard. He just stood there, quiet and steady, holding his book against his chest like it was an anchor. I felt his fingers tighten around mine, not in fear, in decision. Richard shifted his weight, waiting for a response. The pause stretched longer than he seemed comfortable with. He cleared his throat softly, the first crack in his polished rhythm. You remember me, right? Richard asked, lowering his voice again. I'm your dad. The word landed heavy. Evan's eyes moved over Richard's face slowly, as if he were studying something unfamiliar. He took in the smile, the suit, the posture that leaned forward just enough to appear caring. Then his gaze flicked to Vanessa, who stood a little too straight, her lips pressed together now. I know who you are, Evan said. His voice was calm, clear, too composed for a 9-year-old. Richard's smile widened with relief. That's good, he said quickly. I was worried you might have forgotten. Evan shook his head, once, small, certain. I didn't forget, he said. I just remember different things. The air changed. I felt it before I understood it. A subtle tightening, like the moment before a string snaps. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Richard's brows lifted just a fraction. Like what? Richard asked, still smiling, but slower now. Evan glanced up at me briefly. Not for permission, for grounding. Then he looked back at Richard. I remember when you said you'd come to my school play, he said, and then you didn't. Richard's smile faltered. I remember when you said you'd call, Evan continued, and then you texted instead. Vanessa shifted her stance. I remember Mom sitting with me when I was sick, Evan said, every time. The bookstore was quiet now, not the comfortable kind, the kind where people pretend not to listen while hearing everything. Richard let out a small laugh, too quick, too sharp. Buddy, that was a long time ago, he said. Grown-up schedules can be complicated. Evan nodded, like he understood. Yeah, he said. That's why I stopped waiting. Something in Richard's face hardened. Not anger. Something worse. Exposure. I felt my chest tighten, pride and fear colliding at once. I wanted to pull Evan back, to protect him from what might come next. But he stood his ground. He wasn't accusing, he was remembering. And I realized then that this wasn't a child speaking from confusion or resentment. This was a child who had already grieved. Richard straightened slowly, his performance slipping just enough to show the strain underneath. He had come here to rewrite the past. Instead, my son had quietly reminded him that the past still existed. And it was watching him closely. Richard straightened his jacket like he was resetting himself. I recognized the move. It was what he did before presentations, before negotiations, before conversations he intended to win. The softness drained from his expression, replaced by something measured and deliberate. Well, he said, glancing around again. Maybe we should talk honestly. My stomach tightened. Vanessa leaned in slightly, her hand brushing his arm, a silent signal of encouragement. She looked confident again, like whatever had just happened could still be controlled. Richard turned fully toward Evan. You know, he began carefully, there are different ways families can look. Sometimes kids live with their dads, sometimes with their moms, sometimes both. I felt my breath catch. He was building to something. I could hear it in the pacing of his words, the way he layered them slowly like bricks. I have a bigger place now, he continued, a quieter neighborhood, more structure. It might be easier. Evan didn't react. Richard took that as permission. Have you ever thought about coming to stay with me for a while? He asked. At least part-time. The question landed like a dropped plate. I felt heat rush to my face, fear clawing up my throat. This wasn't a conversation for a bookstore. This wasn't a conversation for a child. This was a tactic. Vanessa smiled gently, stepping closer. We'd make sure you had everything you need, she said. Your own room, new books, a routine. I wanted to speak. I wanted to stop it. Every instinct screamed at me to pull Evan away, to shut this down before it became something that could be twisted and used. But Evan spoke first. Why? He asked. The simplicity of it threw Richard off. Why what? Richard replied. Why now? Evan said. You didn't want to before. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Things change, he said. People grow. Evan nodded slowly, considering. Did you grow when Mom lost her job? He asked. Vanessa inhaled sharply. Richard's eyes flicked to me, then back to Evan. That wasn't... Did you grow when you didn't come to my birthday? Evan continued, his voice still calm. Or when you said you were busy again? The room felt smaller, closer, like the walls had leaned in. I'm just saying, Richard said, a hint of irritation breaking through, that I can give you more. Evan looked at him then, really looked at him. I don't need more, he said. I needed you. Silence fell hard and absolute. In that moment, I saw it clearly. Richard hadn't asked that question because he cared about Evan's answer. He asked because he expected control. What he got instead was the truth. And truth, when spoken plainly, has a way of dismantling everything built on performance. No one spoke after Evan's words. Not Richard, not Vanessa, not me. The sentence hung in the air, simple and devastating, like something that couldn't be argued with because it wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. And facts don't bend just because someone wants them to. I don't need more. I needed you. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For the first time since he walked into the bookstore, he looked unsure of what to say next. His eyes flicked around the room, searching for something familiar to hold on to. A reaction, a distraction, a way out. There wasn't one. Vanessa shifted beside him, her confidence draining in small, visible ways. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, her weight moving from one heel to the other. This wasn't the version of the moment she had imagined. There was no gratitude, no softness, no child eager to be impressed. People nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. A woman near the travel section stood completely still, her book forgotten. A man by the counter glanced over, then didn't look away. The silence had drawn attention, and attention was dangerous. Richard cleared his throat. "Evan," he said carefully, "you're too young to understand everything that happened." Evan didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. "I understand waiting," he said. "I understand promises." Richard's jaw tightened. "Adults make mistakes," he replied. "That doesn't mean they stop caring." Evan nodded again, the same calm motion as before. "Then why didn't you come back?" The question was quiet, unavoidable. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from something closer to awe. My son wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He was simply asking the question that had lived inside him for years. Richard looked at me then. Not at Evan, at me. There it was. The unspoken request. The expectation that I would step in, that I would soften it, that I would redirect, explain, protect him from the consequences of his own choices. I didn't. I stayed exactly where I was. Richard turned back to Evan, his composure fraying. "It's complicated," he said, his voice lower now. "You'll understand when you're older." Evan shook his head. "I already understand," he said. "You wanted something else?" That was when the silence shifted again. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It was exposing. Richard straightened, his smile gone entirely. Vanessa looked down at the floor. And in that quiet, I realized something important. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. And Richard had just lost control of the only thing he'd ever relied on. The story. Richard tried to recover. I could see it in the way his shoulders squared, the way his chin lifted as if posture alone could restore authority. He inhaled slowly, like a man reminding himself who he believed he was. "Evan," he said, forcing calm into his voice, "this isn't the place for this conversation." The irony almost made me laugh. Evan looked around the bookstore, then back at his father. His expression didn't change. If anything, it softened, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. "You're right," he said. "It's not." Richard nodded quickly, grateful for the opening. "Good. Then maybe we can talk later, privately." Evan shook his head. "No," he said. "Later doesn't work?" Richard frowned. "Why not?" Evan took a breath. A small one. The kind people take before saying something they've carried for a long time. "Because later is when you usually leave," he said. The words weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, they didn't need to be. Vanessa's head snapped up. Richard froze. Evan continued, his voice steady, almost gentle. "You talk when people are watching. You promise when it sounds nice, and then later you disappear." The colour drained from Richard's face. "That's not fair," he said quickly. "You don't see everything." Evan nodded. "I know. I only see what you do." A beat passed. Then Evan said the sentence that shattered what was left of the performance. "You always need someone to be looking at you," he said, "but you never look back." The bookstore felt like it stopped breathing. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to Vanessa, then to me, then away entirely. For the first time, he looked exposed. Not misunderstood, not attacked, seen. "I didn't mean," he started. Evan cut him off, not sharply, just firmly. "I'm not mad," he said. "I just don't trust you." That was it. Trust wasn't something Richard could argue his way into. It wasn't something he could buy, perform, or negotiate. Vanessa stepped back, her hand slipping from his arm. Her face was pale now, her lips pressed tight. This wasn't the man she thought she'd married. This wasn't power. This was collapse. Richard straightened abruptly, anger flashing through the cracks. "You're being influenced," he snapped, looking at me again. "This isn't coming from him." I finally spoke. "It is," I said quietly, "because you taught him." Richard turned back to Evan, his voice rough. "I'm still your father." Evan met his gaze without flinching. "I know," he said. "That's why this hurts." Richard staggered back a step like he'd been struck, because at that moment he understood something he'd spent years avoiding. You can survive being hated, but being irrelevant to your own child is something else entirely. Richard tried to laugh it off. It came out wrong. Too sharp. Too late. "Kids say things," he said, forcing a breath through his nose. "They repeat what they hear." Evan didn't react. He shifted the book in his arms, then looked up at his father with a seriousness that felt far older than 9. "There's something else," he said. I felt my pulse spike. Richard's smile tightened. "What is it, buddy?" Evan glanced at the ceiling, as if checking his memory against something invisible. "You used to tap the counter 3 times when you were nervous," he said, "at night. When you thought I was asleep." Richard's eyes flicked down to his hand. It was tapping. Once. Twice. He stopped. Vanessa turned to him sharply. "What is he talking about?" Evan continued, undisturbed. "You did it the night you left. You were on the phone in the kitchen. You said, 'It's handled. She won't see it coming.'" The air drained from the room. Richard stared at Evan now, not like a father, but like a man who had just realized a door he thought was closed had never been locked. "I remember because you knocked over my dinosaur cup," Evan said. "The blue one. You got mad at the mess, not at yourself." Vanessa's breath caught. "Richard, that's not—" Richard started, then stopped, because it was. I felt my knees weaken, memories snapping into focus. That night, the spilled cup, the way he'd apologized too quickly, eyes already somewhere else. Evan looked at me then, just for a second, and I understood. He wasn't saying this for me. He was saying it because he'd carried it alone for too long. "You said it would be easier once people believed you," Evan added quietly, "that you just needed time." Richard stepped back like the floor had shifted under him. "That was a private conversation," he said hoarsely. "You couldn't have—" "I was there," Evan replied. "You just didn't look." Silence swallowed the bookstore again. Vanessa slowly pulled her arm away from Richard's. Her face had gone completely still, like someone processing a reality she hadn't prepared for. "You told me she was unstable," she said softly, "that she made things up." Richard didn't answer. From behind us, a chair scraped lightly against the floor. "I believe him," a calm voice said. I turned. A man stood near the history section, holding a book under his arm, mid-40s, steady eyes, familiar in a way I hadn't placed yet. "I'm Julian Brooks," he said, "and I've been waiting for this part of the story to surface." Richard's face collapsed, because whatever control he thought he still had vanished in that moment. Some truths don't come out screaming. They come out remembered, and once spoken, they cannot be put back. Julian Brooks stepped forward slowly, like someone who understood the weight of timing. He wasn't dramatic about it. No raised voice, no sudden movement. He simply placed the book he was holding back onto the shelf, spine aligned, then turned his attention fully to Richard. The calm in his posture contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from the center of the room. "I didn't plan on interrupting," Julian said evenly, "but when a child starts telling the truth out loud, it's usually time for adults to stop pretending." Richard scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "And who are you supposed to be?" Julian met his gaze without hesitation. "Someone who works in legal publishing and media ethics. Someone who reviews cases where narratives are manufactured and sold as fact." Vanessa's eyes flicked between the two men. What does that have to do with us? Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim flash drive. He didn't hand it to anyone yet. He just held it there, visible. This, he said, contains email metadata, login records, and IP traces connected to the messages that cost Claire her job. Richard's face was drained of colour. That's impossible, he said quickly. Those emails were anonymous, Julian nodded. Anonymous to people who don't know where to look. He turned slightly toward me. Claire, I didn't want to involve myself until I was certain, but when I recognized the timeline, the language patterns and the device signatures, it became clear. Vanessa took a step back. Richard, she whispered, you said she was careless, that she destroyed her own career. Richard didn't look at her. Julian continued, his voice steady. The emails originated from a secondary laptop registered to a corporate account under Richard Hale's name, an account he claimed he no longer used. Richard laughed again, sharper now. That proves nothing. Anyone could have accessed it. Julian's eyes hardened. That's true, except for the fact that the login coincided with your location data. Repeatedly. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't emotional. It was evidentiary. Vanessa covered her mouth, shaking her head slowly. You told me you were protecting your son, she said. You told me she was unstable. Richard finally snapped. I did what I had to do, he said. She was in the way. The words landed like a confession. Julian nodded once. And that, he said, is why the case will reopen. Richard looked around wildly, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. For years he had controlled the story by staying one step ahead. But stories collapse when facts walk in quietly and sit down. And in that bookstore, with strangers listening and his son watching, Richard Hale realized the narrative no longer belonged to him. Vanessa was the first one to step away from Richard. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no accusations. Just a small instinctive movement backward, like someone realizing the ground beneath them wasn't solid after all. Her heels scraped softly against the wooden floor, and that sound felt louder than anything Richard had said. You told me this was all behind you, she said, her voice low, controlled. You said the worst part was over. Richard didn't answer. He was staring at Julian now, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. The confident man who had walked into the bookstore minutes earlier was gone. In his place stood someone cornered by his own choices. I didn't lie, Richard said finally. I just simplified. Vanessa let out a short, humorless laugh. You destroyed her career, she said. You almost took her child, and you're calling that simplified? People were openly watching now. No one pretended anymore. A woman near the counter crossed her arms. A man whispered something to the cashier. The room had chosen its side without saying a word. Richard turned toward me, desperation breaking through his anger. You're enjoying this, he said. You wanted this. I shook my head slowly. I wanted peace, I replied. You wanted control. Julian stepped in again, not aggressively but decisively. What matters now, he said, is that the truth has surfaced in front of witnesses, and that changes everything. Vanessa looked at Evan. Her expression shifted then, something raw slipping through the polished exterior. Did you really hear him say those things? She asked quietly. Evan nodded once. Yes. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet. I believed him, she said more to herself than anyone else. I built my life around his version of the world. Richard reached for her arm. Vanessa, don't. She pulled away. No, she said firmly. Don't touch me. That word carried weight. For the first time, Richard looked genuinely afraid. Not losing a case, not of public embarrassment, but of losing the image that had protected him for so long. Vanessa straightened, lifting her chin. You didn't marry me because you loved me, she said. You married me because I am fit. Richard said nothing. She looked at me then, eyes steady. "I'm sorry," she said. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't performative, it was late. But it was real. Julian glanced at his watch. "I've already forwarded copies to the appropriate parties," he said. "After today, this won't stay contained." Richard's shoulders sagged. The mask had slipped. The audience had seen behind it. And no amount of charm could pull it back into place again. Richard snapped. Not loudly at first. It started in his hands, fingers curling and uncurling, like he was trying to grab something invisible. His breathing grew uneven, chest rising too fast for a man who once prided himself on composure. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." No one responded. That silence did something to him. "I worked for everything I have," Richard continued, louder now. "Everything. You don't get to rewrite my life because of a few misunderstandings." Julian didn't flinch. "They aren't misunderstandings," he said calmly. "They're patterns." Vanessa shook her head slowly. "Listen to yourself," she said. "You're still performing." That word hit harder than any accusation. Richard turned on her. "Don't act like you're innocent," he snapped. "You knew who I was when you married me." Her eyes flashed. "I knew who you said you were." People nearby began murmuring openly now. A phone appeared in someone's hand, angled carefully. The moment was no longer private. Richard sensed it, and panic edged into his voice. "You think this makes you better than me?" he said, looking around wildly. "You think one kid's feelings erase years of facts?" Evan tightened his grip on my hand. I felt his fear then, sharp and sudden, and something inside me hardened. "Enough," I said. It was the first time I raised my voice. Richard turned toward me, eyes blazing. "You did this," he said. "You turned him against me." I stepped forward, placing myself fully between him and my son. "No," I said evenly. "You did that yourself. Every time you choose an image over presence." Richard laughed, harsh and broken. "You were always jealous," he said. "You couldn't stand that I moved on." Vanessa flinched. "Stop," she said, "just stop." But Richard couldn't. The dam had broken. "I carried you," he shouted, gesturing toward me. "I gave you a life, and this is how you repay me?" The words echoed through the bookstore. I saw it then, the full collapse, the moment when everyone finally saw what I had lived with for years. Not the charming executive, not the devoted father, but a man who believed love was leveraged. Julian spoke quietly. "You're being recorded." Richard froze. His eyes darted to the raised phone, then to the faces watching him with thinly veiled disgust. The realization hit him all at once. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was damage. He straightened, smoothing his jacket with shaking hands, trying to reclaim himself. But it was too late. The performance had slipped too far. And in that moment, Richard Hale understood something he had never prepared for. Power only works when people believe in it. And no one believed him anymore. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, the way real consequences usually do. Julian made a phone call just outside the bookstore, his voice low, controlled. He didn't dramatize anything. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself now, backed by witnesses, recordings, and a child's unfiltered truth. When he returned, he met my eyes and gave a small nod. It was already in motion. Richard tried to leave. He muttered something about needing air, about this being inappropriate, about lawyers. He took 2 steps toward the door before a calm but firm voice stopped him. "Sir," the store manager said, stepping forward, "you'll need to calm down or leave the premises." Richard laughed bitterly. "Trust me," he said. "I'm leaving." Vanessa didn't follow him. She stood frozen near the display table, staring at the floor as if the polished wood might give her answers. When Richard looked back at her, expecting loyalty out of habit, she didn't move. "I need time," she said quietly, "and distance." Richard's face twisted, anger and disbelief colliding. "After everything I've done for you," she looked up then, eyes steady. "That's the problem. Everything you do is transactional." He turned away without another word. By Monday morning, the emails had reached Richard's firm. By Tuesday, he was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The language was careful, corporate, impersonal. It didn't complain. It didn't defend. It simply removed him from power. The custody review was suspended by the end of the week. New information, my lawyer said. Significant concerns about credibility. I sat in my kitchen when I got the call, Evan doing homework at the table, his pencil tapping lightly as he worked. I watched his face, the familiar line of concentration between his brows, and felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in years. Richard tried to call that night. I didn't answer. Not out of spite. Out of boundaries. Later I learned he'd sent emails to colleagues, framing the incident as a misunderstanding, stress, divorce, a difficult child. None of it worked. Once the mask cracks publicly, people start re-examining everything. Reputation doesn't collapse because of one moment. It collapses because the moment confirms what others already suspected. Richard lost clients, then allies, then silence replaced his certainty. And while his world shrank, mine finally stopped trembling. Because consequences aren't loud, they're permanent. And for the first time, they were his to carry alone. The first thing that returned to me wasn't money, it was sleep. For weeks after the bookstore, I had expected the familiar knot in my chest to tighten again, to wait for the next email, the next accusation, the next twist that would pull the ground out from under me. But it didn't come. The nights grew quieter, deeper. I slept without waking to rehearse defenses in my head. Evan noticed before I did. "You don't sigh as much anymore," he said one morning as I packed his lunch. I smiled at that, realizing how much he had been watching me all along. The second thing that returned was my name. A former colleague reached out first, then another, carefully at first, like they weren't sure they were allowed to. The tone was different now, apologetic, curious. A publisher asked if I'd consider reviewing a manuscript off the record. Another asked if I was open to contract work again. I said yes. Not because I was desperate, because I was ready. The check from the first assignment wasn't large, but it felt enormous in my hands. Proof that my skills had never disappeared. They'd only been buried under someone else's story. Evan and I celebrated with takeout and a movie on the couch. Nothing extravagant, just laughter. Our legs tangled together, the simple relief of knowing tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. Julian stopped by that weekend. Not with news, not with documents. Just coffee and a question about a book Evan had mentioned liking. He stayed for an hour, maybe two. We talked about work, about loss, about how strange it feels when your life finally slows down after years of running. He didn't offer to fix anything. He didn't need to. The court decision came quietly a few weeks later. Full custody remained with me. The review was officially closed. No appeals, no conditions, just a single page that confirmed what had always been true. I framed it, not because I needed the reminder, but because Evan deserved to see that truth wins, even when it takes time. Richard faded from our lives without drama. No apologies, no redemption arc. Just distance. And for the first time, distance felt like mercy, not loss. One evening, Evan and I returned to the same bookstore. He picked out a new book. I paid without checking the price first. As we walked out, he slipped his hand into mine and said, "Mum, we're okay now." I squeezed his fingers. "Yes," I said, "we are." And for the first time, I believed it without hesitation. Healing didn't arrive like a celebration. It arrived in small, ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves at all. Mornings became slower. I stopped rushing Evan out the door as if time itself were chasing us. We ate breakfast at the table again instead of standing by the sink. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. The silence no longer felt dangerous. I started walking in the park after dropping him at school. No phone calls. No rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Just movement, breath, and the sound of my own thoughts settling into something manageable. At home, I reorganized the apartment one drawer at a time. Old paperwork went into a shredder. Court documents disappeared into labeled folders, then into a box I didn't need to open anymore. The space felt lighter with each decision, as if my surroundings were catching up to my mind. In the evenings, Evan did his homework at the kitchen table while I worked nearby. Not late into the night like before, just enough. I relearned how to stop, how to trust that rest wasn't laziness, but maintenance. Julian became a steady presence, though never intrusive. Sometimes he dropped off a book he thought I'd like. Sometimes he just checked in with a text that didn't require an immediate answer. There was no pressure to define anything, no urgency to label what was forming. That mattered more than I realized. One night after Evan had gone to bed, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea and opened a book I'd owned for years, but never had the peace to read. The words felt different now, less like instructions for survival, more like reflections I could choose from. I didn't feel fixed, but I felt intact. Evan started sleeping through the night again. No bad dreams, no sudden questions whispered into the dark. When he laughed, it came from his chest instead of his throat, unguarded and easy. The past still existed. It always would, but it no longer dictated the present. One afternoon, Evan asked if we could donate some of his old toys. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't need them anymore." We packed them together, talking about nothing important. When we finished, he looked around the apartment and smiled. "It feels like a new place," he said. I looked at him, then around the room I had rebuilt piece by piece. "It is," I said, "because we are." Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finally living without fear of remembering. Richard's life didn't implode the way movies like to show it. There were no headlines, no public apologies, no dramatic downfall that satisfied curiosity. What happened to him was quieter, and somehow worse. He moved out of the apartment he'd once called an upgrade. The lease wasn't renewed. The neighborhood that had made him feel important became just another place he no longer belonged. Former colleagues stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up. Meetings were cancelled without explanation. People didn't confront him. They distanced themselves. That was the punishment Richard had never prepared for. He'd always believed power lived in visibility, in being seen and admired. When the attention vanished, so did the version of himself he'd built his life around. Vanessa left a month later. Not in anger, not with accusations, just a suitcase and a note that said she needed honesty more than comfort. Richard read it alone in a quiet apartment and realized, too late, that charm can't replace character forever. Evan asked about his father once. "Is he okay?" he said, not with concern but with curiosity. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "and it's not your job to worry about that." He nodded, accepting it in the simple way children do when they feel safe enough to let go. Meanwhile, my life continued to open in unexpected directions. More work came in. Not overwhelming, not desperate, just steady. I chose projects carefully now, valuing time as much as income. Evenings stayed ours. Weekends felt like weekends again. Julian became part of that rhythm naturally. He showed up without trying to take space that wasn't offered. Sometimes he cooked dinner. Sometimes he sat on the floor helping Evan with a puzzle, listening more than speaking. Trust grew without force, the way real things do. One afternoon as we walked through the park, Evan ran ahead toward the playground. Julian slowed his steps to match mine. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I just want to be here if you want me." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt something warm and steady settle in my chest. Not rescue, not dependency, choice. Richard had once believed winning meant taking. I was learning that fulfillment comes from being chosen for who you are, not what you provide. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Evan waved us over laughing. I took Julian's hand without thinking, and in that simple, unguarded moment, I understood the final truth. Some people lose everything chasing control. Others gain everything by finally letting it go. A year passed quietly. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned. Life didn't transform overnight. There were no sudden leaps, no dramatic declarations. Just a steady accumulation of moments that felt solid underfoot. Work became reliable again. Evan grew taller, stronger, more confident in ways that didn't ask for permission. And Julian stayed, not as a savior, not as a solution, but as a presence that never demanded to be the center of anything. One afternoon, we returned to the same bookstore near the park. The bell above the door rang softly, just as it had before, but this time it didn't tighten my chest. It felt familiar, friendly. Evan went straight to the shelves, already knowing where he wanted to be. I watched him from a distance, smiling at how easily he moved through the space now, like someone who belonged everywhere he stood. Julian stood beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Hard to believe this place changed everything," he said. I nodded. "It didn't change everything," I replied. "It revealed it." He smiled at that. Later that evening, after Evan had gone to bed, Julian and I sat at the small kitchen table, the window open to the city sounds drifting in. He didn't make a speech. He didn't kneel. He simply reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't want to replace anything in your life," he said. "I want to build something new with you, if you're ready." I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. We married 6 months later in a quiet ceremony at the park. No extravagance. Just a few close friends, sunlight through the trees, and Evan standing between us holding both our hands. He smiled the entire time. Richard didn't attend. He wasn't invited. Not out of cruelty, but because his chapter in our lives was finished. Completely. Cleanly. After the ceremony, Evan hugged me tightly and whispered, "You look happy." "I am," I told him, "because I'm free." That night, as we walked home together, I thought about how the story had started, with fear, with loss, with a man who believed control was love. It ended with something far better: choice, stability, trust. Not everything broken needs to be repaired the way it was. Some things are meant to be rebuilt differently. And sometimes, the ending that feels the most satisfying is the one where you don't win against someone else. You simply win your life back. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, truly still here, then something in this story touched you in a quiet but meaningful way. What this journey reminds us is simple but not easy. You don't heal by winning arguments or proving someone wrong. You heal by choosing what's within your control. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Claire didn't chase revenge. She chose integrity, presence, and truth. And in doing so, life slowly returned what was taken, not as punishment for others, but as peace for herself. Another Stoic idea says, what stands in the way becomes the way. The pain, the betrayal, the public humiliation, none of it was wasted. It became clear. It became boundaries. It became a better life built on honesty instead of fear. If you're walking through something similar right now, remember this: being calm is not weakness, and choosing yourself is not selfish. Sometimes the most powerful comeback is simply living well. If this story spoke to you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. These stories are for people who are healing, quietly, bravely, and one step at a time. You're not alone, and you're exactly where you need to be.